Some deaths are accidents. This one was a choice. 100 small choices. You think the wilderness is dangerous because that's wild. But mountains don't care whether your map came from a ranger, a guidebook, or an artificial intelligence that sounds absolutely certain. Snow doesn't recognize confidence. Gravity doesn't pause because an app promised an easy hike. Out here, every shortcut begins with trust, and every wrong assumption compounds until there are no easy decisions left to make. Nature doesn't argue with you. It simply waits for the moment your preparation no longer matches reality. By then, turning around may no longer be the easiest option. It may already be the hardest. The tragedy isn't always the storm or the cliff. Sometimes it's believing you've already done enough homework. These are the warnings they ignored. This is preventable. The plan that never walked the trail. In the spring of 2025, 2 hikers set out for a day in the North Shore Mountains of British Columbia. Their identities were never made public. Their mistake was. For the 2 hikers, their outing to Unnecessary Mountain would be a debacle that nearly became a tragedy. It began the way so many modern hikes begin now. Not with a topographic map spread across a kitchen table, not with a phone call to a ranger station, not with a conversation with someone who had stood on that summit within the last week. It began with a different kind of conversation, a question typed into a chatbot, a route requested, a route received in seconds, formatted neatly, phrased with the calm authority of something that has never once been wrong. They reportedly used ChatGPT to help plan their path toward the summit of Unnecessary Mountain, a peak whose very name seems, in hindsight, to carry a warning nobody was listening for. There is no evidence the artificial intelligence invented the mountain or lied about its existence, or hallucinated a trail that was never there. The mountain was real. The trail, in a general sense, was real too. What the 2 hikers received instead was something more dangerous than outright fiction. An itinerary that sounded complete, sounded like it had been checked against the ground itself, when in truth it had been assembled from patterns, from averages, from what hikes like this one usually look like in a world with no weather, no season, no snowpack, and no memory of the last time anyone had actually walked that ridge. An itinerary produced this way is not a lie. It is worse in a sense because it is not trying to deceive anyone. It is simply guessing, fluently, in the voice of certainty. A guidebook admits its limits with a publication date printed on the cover. A ranger admits uncertainty out loud in a tone you can hear. A language model does neither. It answers every question with the same steady confidence. Whether the question is trivial or life or death, whether the underlying information is fresh or stale by years. The 2 hikers had no way of knowing, from the text alone, which kind of answer they had received. An itinerary is not a guarantee. At best, it is a starting point. A rough sketch to be tested against reality, cross-checked against people who had recently been on the mountain, verified against agencies whose entire purpose is to know, in real time, what conditions actually look like above the tree line. The 2 hikers treated it as an ending point instead. They treated the conversation as the research, rather than the beginning of it. North Shore Rescue, the volunteer search and rescue team that has spent decades pulling underprepared hikers off these slopes, would later say what they always say, in one form or another, that this incident reflected something they had been watching grow for years, long before this particular chatbot existed. People were trusting digital convenience over verified, current local information. It had happened with outdated blogs. It had happened with crowdsourced hiking apps that let anyone draw a line across a map and call it a trail. Now it was happening with something that spoke in complete, grammatically perfect sentences. And somehow that fluency made people trust it more, not less. A guidebook can be updated with the new printing. A ranger can look out a window and tell you what the sky is doing right now. A language model, however articulate, cannot see snow. It cannot feel wind shift direction. It does not know and cannot know what the mountain looked like this morning because it was never there and it will never be there, no matter how many times it is asked. What looked like a modern convenience had already set the first link in a chain that the mountain had seen many times before. Only the vocabulary around it was new. The mountain doesn't read your itinerary. Unnecessary Mountain rises above Vancouver's North Shore, close enough to the city that its silhouette is visible from downtown streets on a clear day, close enough that a person could finish breakfast in their own kitchen and be standing at a trailhead within the hour. That proximity is part of the danger, not an antidote to it. A mountain you can see from your apartment window feels tame. It feels close, familiar, already halfway conquered just by being visible. It feels in the particular delusion of late spring, finished with winter. It was not. Late spring on the coastal ranges of British Columbia carries a cruel contradiction, one that catches hikers every single year, long before any chatbot entered the picture. And down in the city, the temperature climbs steadily through April and May. Sidewalks dry out, trees leaf. People shed jackets and plan casual hikes the way they'd plan a walk through a neighborhood park, checking nothing more than whether it might rain. But elevation does not negotiate with the calendar. 1,000 meters higher, winter lingers stubbornly, indifferent to what the valley below is doing, indifferent to sunny weekends and short sleeves and warm forecasts on a phone screen. Snow that fell in January can still be sitting on a north-facing slope in June. Dense, wet, granular, refrozen, and thawed 100 times over, unstable underfoot in ways that summer snow could never replicate. The hazards waiting in that snow were not exotic. They were the same hazards that have claimed hikers on this exact range for generations. Long documented, long warned against, long ignored by exactly the kind of confident newcomer the mountain has always attracted. Trail markers, buried or obscured beneath late season snow, vanish precisely when they are needed most, leaving hikers to guess at a payoff that in summer would have been impossible to lose. Drop-offs that would be obvious on bare rock become invisible beneath the smooth, deceptively gentle-looking white surface, concealed until a boot finds nothing underneath it and the ground simply isn't there anymore. Steep snow traverses, which look survivable from a distance, a simple diagonal line across an open slope, turn a straightforward hike into something closer to technical mountaineering, demanding an ice axe, crampons, or traction devices, and the specific trained judgment to know when a slope is safe to cross and when it is not. And above all of it sits alpine weather that can shift in under an hour, turning a bright photogenic morning into a whiteout with visibility measured in meters, arriving with barely enough warning for a falling barometer that nobody on the trail that day was carrying, let alone watching. North Shore Rescue has repeated the same message for years, in press conferences after search has gone right, in interviews after search has gone wrong, in blunt social media posts written specifically for people exactly like the two hikers who set out that morning. Rely on official trail reports, published and updated by people who have recently been on the ground. Check current conditions, not seasonal averages pulled from some general understanding of what late spring usually looks like. Carry proper alpine equipment, not summer gear quietly repurposed for winter terrain because it was already in the closet. Trust experienced judgment, human judgment, tested against this specific mountain on this specific day by people who have stood exactly where you are about to stand. Not generative advice assembled from patterns in old, undated, unverifiable data. The team had already responded more than once in recent years to hikers led astray by inaccurate GPS mapping applications that drew confident lines across terrain nobody had walked in months. They had responded to hikers following unofficial trails worn into the forest by other lost hikers before them. False paths that looked, at a glance, exactly as legitimate as the real one. This was not the first time technology had promised a certainty it could not actually deliver. It was simply the newest version of an old mistake, wearing a newer, more articulate, more convincing face, one that didn't just point at a line on a map but explained itself in full sentences, answered follow-up questions, and never once said the words "I don't know." The mountain offered plenty of warnings that day. Bare patches beside deep drifts, soft, rotten snow beneath a crust that looked solid, a sky that darkened faster than the forecast had suggested. None of those warnings arrived in a chat window. None of them were phrased as helpfully as the itinerary had been. And so, for a while, none of them were heard. A chain of small decisions. Every disaster in these mountains can be traced backward, decision by decision, to the moment it was still fully preventable. This one was no different. Here is the chain, link by link, each one small enough on its own to seem forgivable. Decision 1. The two hikers used an artificial intelligence tool as their primary source of route information, rather than verifying that plan through official park authorities, posted trail condition reports, or a phone call to someone with recent first-hand knowledge of the mountain. A chatbot can describe a trail in confident, tidy prose. It cannot walk it. It cannot report back from the summit ridge an hour before departure, the way another hiker on a forum sometimes can. The decision to treat an AI-generated itinerary as sufficient on its own, without a second layer of verification, was the first crack in an otherwise ordinary plan. Decision 2. They assumed the route recommended to them was appropriate for the current season, rather than confirming that assumption against anything current at all. Late spring alpine terrain does not resemble late spring valley terrain, not even closely. And a route that reads as a moderate, family-friendly day hike in July can be an entirely different proposition. A snow-covered, route-finding, judgment-testing gauntlet in May. The quiet assumption that hike meant the same experience at every elevation on every date on the calendar was the kind of small, reasonable-sounding error that rarely gets a second thought before departure. It is precisely those quiet, reasonable-sounding errors that end up killing people. Decision 3. They entered snow-covered alpine terrain without equipment reportedly suited to those conditions. The exact gear the two hikers carried that day has not been publicly documented, and that detail should not be assumed beyond what is actually known. What is known with certainty is the terrain they encountered and what that terrain has always demanded of anyone crossing it safely. Traction devices for icy or refrozen snow, poles or an axe for balance and self-arrest on a slope, and layers built for sustained exposure at altitude, not 4 miles spring afternoon down in the city. Decision 4. When conditions no longer match what they had expected, they continued forward rather than turning back. This is, of every decision in this chain, the most human and arguably the most dangerous. Turning around at the first sign of mismatch between plan and reality costs almost nothing. A shortened day, a story about the one that got away. Turning around after hours of steady progress costs something else entirely. Pride, remaining daylight, and the nagging, persistent sense that the effort already spent should not go to waste. That sense is a lie the mind tells itself over and over in mountains all over the world to justify pressing forward into worsening danger instead of accepting a smaller, survivable defeat. Decision 5. They failed to fully appreciate how quickly a routine hike becomes technical travel once snow obscures the trail beneath it. Underneath a blanket of snow, a well-marked path and an unmarked, unstable slope can look completely identical to an untrained eye. The two hikers were, without necessarily recognizing the shift as it happened, no longer simply hiking. They had crossed step by step into something closer to mountaineering, moving across steep, snow-covered terrain in gear chosen for a summer trail, following a route selected by a machine that had never once seen, and never could see, the ground it so confidently described. Each of these decisions, taken in isolation, seemed survivable, even ordinary. People make small miscalculations on trails every single week, in every range on this continent, and walk away with nothing worse than a sore knee, a late return, and a story to tell at dinner. But decisions like these rarely exist in isolation. They stack quietly, one on top of the next. They compound in ways that are invisible in the moment and painfully obvious only afterward, from a distance laid out in a sequence like this one. Together, this particular chain of 5 ordinary seeming choices eliminated nearly every margin the two hikers had carried with them into the mountains that morning. Margin they would need and would not have before the day was over. The disaster did not begin the moment they became stranded on that slope. It began much earlier, quietly, unremarkably, the moment reality stopped matching the plan and nobody stopped walking long enough to notice the gap. When confidence gives way to survival. No public medical report has been released in this case, and that fact bears repeating clearly, because so much of what follows describes a fate the two hikers narrowly avoided, not one they ultimately suffered. Both hikers survived. What comes next is the physiological chain that search and rescue teams believe they very likely interrupted before it could finish closing around the two of them. Prolonged exposure in alpine terrain follows a predictable, well-documented progression, one that teams like North Shore Rescue witness often enough to describe almost clinically, the way a physician describes the stages of an illness they have seen 100 times before. It begins with cold stress, a persistent, gnawing chill the body cannot fully shake, even through continued movement, even through added layers pulled tighter against the wind. The body responds by narrowing blood flow toward its core, protecting vital organs at the direct expense of the extremities. Fingers stiffen first, then thicken, clumsy and slow. Dexterity fades in a way that feels almost insulting in how quickly it arrives. Small tasks that would take seconds and warmth, unzipping a pack, tightening a bootlace, opening a snack wrapper, begin to take minutes in the cold, then longer, then become tasks abandoned entirely because the hands simply will not cooperate. As the cold deepens, movement slows in step with it. Muscles working in a colder environment become measurably less efficient, drawing down energy reserves faster while producing less power in return, more prone to stumbling on terrain that a fresh, warm, rested body would have navigated cleanly hours earlier. And fatigue on a slope covered in wet, unstable, late-season snow is never a minor inconvenience. It is the direct precursor to a fall, the kind of fall that, on a steep traverse positioned above a concealed drop-off, does not end with a bruised knee and an embarrassed laugh. It ends potentially with something far worse and far harder to walk away from. Judgment degrades alongside the body, and this is the cruelest part of the entire progression, and the part least understood by people who have never personally experienced it. Cold does not only slow the limbs, it slows the mind behind them. Decision-making narrows, focusing on immediate, small-scale problems while losing sight of the larger, more dangerous picture. Risk assessment weakens quietly without any clear warning sign that it is happening. People in the early to middle stages of hypothermia often continue to believe, with total and unshaken sincerity, that they can still solve their own situation, that the next ridge, the next hour, the next decision will be the one that finally sets things right. That false, persistent confidence is not a symptom sitting apart from the emergency itself. It is the emergency quietly steering outcomes from the inside, convincing exhausted, freezing people that help is not yet necessary, right up until the point where it may already be too late to ask for it. Left unaddressed through a cold night at elevation, this progression continues on toward full hypothermia. Shivering that eventually stops altogether, not because the body has finally warmed, but because it no longer has the energy reserves left to keep shivering at all. Confusion deepens into something closer to disorientation. Coordination collapses to the point where standing, let alone walking, becomes its own significant hazard. And every additional hour spent believing that rescue isn't yet necessary is another hour spent moving closer to a threshold beyond which rescue, however skilled, may simply arrive too late to change the outcome. This is the direction the two hikers were moving in, whether they fully understood it in exactly these terms or not. As the light began to fade and the cold settled deeper into the terrain around them. What sets their story apart from so many others told on this channel is what happened next. They stopped pretending the plan could still work. They recognized before the fog of exhaustion and cold fully closed in around their thinking that this was no longer a situation they could hike, climb, or simply wait their way out of on their own. They requested rescue. It is a decision that costs almost nothing in hindsight, viewed calmly from a warm room afterward, and costs everything in the moment it is actually made, admitting out loud to a dispatcher on the other end of a phone that the entire plan has failed completely, that pride and effort and daylight already spent no longer matter. Many hikers wait far too long to make that specific call, delayed by embarrassment, by lingering hope that the situation will simply resolve itself, by the same quiet overconfidence that led them into trouble in the first place. The two hikers on Unnecessary Mountain did not wait quite that long. The decision that finally broke the chain came after every earlier opportunity to break it had already been missed, one after another, but it still arrived in time. The rescue that didn't have to happen. The call went out to emergency services, and from there, directly to North Shore Rescue, a volunteer team built for exactly this kind of moment. Though never once grateful for the frequency with which moments like it continued to arrive on their radios. Rescue in snow-covered alpine terrain is never simple, even for teams as experienced as this one. Rescuers move by helicopter when weather and visibility allow it, and by foot and rope when they do not, picking their way across the same obscure trail markers, the same hidden drop-offs, the same unstable refrozen snow that trapped the people they are searching for in the first place. The only real difference between rescuer and rescued in that moment is training, equipment, and the hard-earned discipline required to move through that same terrain without becoming a second emergency layered on top of the first. North Shore Rescue located the two hikers and extracted them from the mountain. Both were brought down safely off the snow, off the exposed terrain, and into care. Both survived the day they had set out into that morning expecting to be nothing more than ordinary. In the aftermath, the team's public message was not subtle, and in truth it was not entirely new, though this particular incident gave that long-standing warning a sharper, more contemporary edge than almost any before it. Artificial intelligence, they said, in substance, if not always in these exact words, is not a substitute for official trail planning. A language model can produce advice that sounds complete, sounds confident, sounds thoroughly researched and entirely current, and can be, at the very same time, dangerously outdated or simply quietly wrong about the one thing that matters most on any mountain, what it actually looks like today, right now, underfoot. The story spread well beyond British Columbia, well beyond the North Shore, carried by outlets that rarely cover local search and rescue operations at all. It became one of the first widely reported examples of generative artificial intelligence contributing directly to a real-world wilderness emergency. Not because the technology had lied outright, not because it had invented a mountain or a trail that never existed, but because it had been trusted by two reasonable, capable people to know something it had no genuine way of knowing. There were no fatalities in the story. There were no criminal charges filed. There was no coroner's inquest convened because there was, mercifully, no death to investigate. What there was instead was a rescue log filed by a volunteer team, Two exhausted hikers grateful to be walking again under their own power, and a growing uncomfortable public conversation about the real limits of a tool that so many people had already begun treating as something close to infallible. The story ended with everyone going home that night, but only because the final decision, made just in time, was to ask for help before the mountain was allowed to make that choice for them instead. You don't survive the wilderness by avoiding every mistake. Nobody manages that, not once, not ever. You survive by refusing to let one mistake become 10, by breaking the chain somewhere before it reaches its end. This particular chain could have been broken before a single boot ever touched the trail. It could have been broken by checking official trail conditions instead of accepting a chatbot's confident, well-formatted paragraph as a finished answer. It could have been broken by understanding clearly that a warm valley floor says almost nothing about a winter summit sitting 1,000 meters above it, waiting patiently in a season of its own. It could have been broken by carrying equipment matched to the terrain that was actually likely, rather than the terrain suggested by a pleasant forecast down in the city. It could have been broken by treating artificial intelligence as a starting point for research, one voice among several. Never as a final authority on ground, it has never once walked and never will. And it could have been broken most easily of all at the very first moment the mountain stopped matching the plane in front of them, simply by turning around and accepting that a shortened day beats a long one that ends badly. None of those decisions would have made headlines. None of them would have become a story anyone felt compelled to tell afterward. That is exactly the point. The two hikers walked into the North Shore Mountains that morning expecting technology to reduce their uncertainty, to hand them a finished plan they could simply follow. Instead, standing on a snow-covered slope with the trail markers buried somewhere beneath them, they discovered something older than any chatbot, something the mountain has been teaching people for as long as people have been climbing it. That confidence is not the same thing as accuracy, and that a machine can sound entirely certain while knowing nothing true about the ground beneath your boots. Their story ended in a rescue instead of a recovery, which means they were given something few people in stories like this one ever receive: the rare, hard-won chance to carry the lesson forward themselves, rather than leaving it for a stranger or a documentary to tell on their behalf. Because in the wilderness, every safe trip is built from hundreds of small, unremarkable choices, made correctly, one after another, long before anyone is watching, and every step of it was preventable. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. It might be the cheapest piece of survival gear you ever pick up. Want more preventable? These stories are next. Thank you for watching.